Realtor.com recently published a report that tracked the change in the median home prices between June and September of this year in all the major cities across the United States. The highest rate of decline in the entire country was Austin, Texas, with a little over a 10% drop in the median price in this 3-month period. That median price is still slightly higher when compared to the year-over-year number, so optimists still have something to point to. But with interest rates rising at the fastest pace in the last 40 years, we have officially entered a period where it's going to be very difficult to ignore what's really going on in the Austin housing market. Now, to get a better idea of what might be coming next, I think it's important to look at similar periods from history. What happened in the past won't predict the future, but it will give us a broader perspective, especially if we consider periods outside the last 10 to 15 years. Now, I'll warn you right now, some of you aren't going to like some of the things I'm going to go over in this video. But let me ask you a question. Is it more important for you to be right, or is it more important to find the right answer? Now, for those of you who are willing to consider some things that will change your perspective on what's going on in the Austin real estate market and what we might expect next, stick around for this video, and I'm going to tell you all about it. There has been a lot of analysis about the current housing market, and everybody has a theory about what to expect next. In all this analysis and forecasting, the biggest mistake I see happening time and time again is the only point of comparison usually is the housing crash of 2008. Now, I am a huge advocate of studying history and looking for similarities that could provide clues as to what the future might hold. But history goes back a lot further than the last 10 to 15 years. You can't avoid seeing headlines that talk about inflation at a 40-year high. Well, my first question is, what happened 40 years ago? In the 1970s, the Fed pursued what economists called a stop-and-go monetary policy, which meant they alternated between fighting high employment and high inflation. During the go periods, the Fed lowered interest rates to loosen the money supply to bring unemployment down. And during the stop periods, they raised interest rates to lower inflation. This back and forth was not an effective long-term solution. By the mid-70s, both inflation and unemployment were up. And by the end of the decade, unemployment did begin to tread slightly downward, but inflation was at 11%. In 1979, Paul Volcker became the new Fed chairman, and his plan was to focus exclusively on inflation because failure to carry through now in the fight on inflation will only make any subsequent effort more difficult. If we compare that to this quote from Jerome Powell, who is the current Fed chairman, we can begin to see similarities between the strategies used then and now. Now, since the 80s have already happened, we can look back and analyze what impact those Federal Reserve policies had on the housing market. But instead of looking at the overall national market, let's consider a housing market from the 70s that shares a lot of similarities with modern-day Austin. The population of the Los Angeles metro doubled in the 30 years between 1950 and 1980. In comparison, the population of the Austin metro quadrupled in the 30 years between 1990 and 2020. Now, these are certainly not identical, but I think we can agree that both of these metros went through a substantial growth spurt in these respective periods. Some might even use the term boom. Another significant thing that happened in Los Angeles during that growth period, especially in the 70s, was the city began to grow out. This is similar to the growth in the Austin suburbs we've seen over the last several years. Now, as for prices, I think we can all agree that Austin housing prices exploded over the last 5 years. The actual number is 99%. In other words, home prices doubled in 5 years. That is a huge change in a short period of time, but it's nothing compared to LA in the 70s. There were some areas of Los Angeles, like Beverly Hills, where property values increased by a factor of 7 in 10 years. During that time, there was a buying frenzy. Someone could borrow money at 7 to 10%, which was considered a good rate then, buy a property and watch it appreciate at least 20% in a year. No fixing or flipping or improving the property. Simply buy it, hold it for a year, and sell it for at least 20% more than you paid for it. Now, if you had an opportunity like that, you'd probably do it, right? Well, everybody did. And as more and more buyers entered the market, that appreciation rate accelerated. Now, does this sound similar to Austin in the last 3 years or so? In our market, someone could borrow money at 3% and see yearly appreciation in the 30 to 40% range. Also remember, we have home equity loans available now, which substantially increases someone's buying power and gives them the ability to make cash offers. Back in the 70s, homeowners couldn't do that. After the price run-ups in the 70s, the Fed stepped in to tame inflation and began aggressively raising the interest rates. The result was the Los Angeles housing market came to a dead stop. People could no longer afford to borrow the same amount of money because the higher interest rates inflated their payments. There were significantly less buyers, so prices dropped. And if a seller wasn't willing to reduce the list price, they couldn't sell the property. This bust cycle lasted for a couple of years, but anybody who was able to buy during that period could acquire a property for much less than what it sold for 5 years earlier, and less for what it would eventually appreciate to once the economy recovered. Now, if you owned a property back then and you were able to hold on to it during the downturn, values eventually came back to where they were before. But remember, California implemented Proposition 13 in 1978, which capped property taxes at 1% of the assessed value and limited yearly increase to 2% per year as long as you didn't sell the house. And one thing that most people outside of California don't realize is Proposition 13 applied to all real estate, including rental properties, which meant it was a lot easier to hold on to a second home or investment property then as it is in the Austin area today. There are a lot of people in the Austin metro who saw their appraised values increase 50 to 60% just in 2022. And if that house was not their primary residence and they didn't have the homestead exemption, the property tax would go up by that same percentage. Now, whether you're willing to admit it or not, the Austin housing market today is very similar to Los Angeles in the 70s and early 80s. Rising interest rates have significantly slowed buyer demand, and both builders and sellers are looking for ways to attract more buyers. Some offer cash concessions to pay for closing costs or buy down the interest rate. Some builders offer promotional rates, but most of them adjust within the first 2 or 3 years. And of course, the most visible are the price reductions. Now, there are a lot of sellers who are still not willing to accept the reality of the current market, and they won't reduce their list prices. If their house won't sell for what they think it should, they take it off the market, maybe rent it out, and plan to hold on to it until they can get the money they think it's worth. We've already talked about the higher costs of holding a second home or rental property in Texas when the property taxes go up. But I think the biggest error in thinking that you can just wait out the market is that it assumes the market recovery is coming soon. After the market bottoms, it usually takes a period of years before prices get back to just where they were before. This short-term thinking is fueled by another thing I keep hearing a lot, and that is home values always go up, especially here in Texas. That is true, but only over the long term. And even though Texas didn't see significant price declines after the 2008 housing crisis, if you extend your study of history back to the late 80s after the oil bust and the savings and loan crisis, you'll find that Texas is not immune to price declines. This article from the Houston Chronicle uses the Home Price Index. It's a measurement published by the Office of Federal Housing Enterprise Oversight. These indexes are valuable because they only track homes purchased with conforming loans, and they track same property transactions. They only track single-family home prices, so no condos, and they aren't skewed by sudden infusions of more expensive homes. Houston was the first Texas city to fall in the oil bust. Its home price index peaked at 108.5 in 1983. It also bottomed earliest, hitting 81.5 in 1987. And Houston had a very long bottom. The index didn't recover to its 1983 level until 1997. So recovery from the market top took 14 years. San Antonio peaked in 1984 and didn't bottom until 1990. It didn't recover to its old high until 1995, which is a period of 11 years. Austin peaked in 1986 at 100.1 and fell to 72.7 in 1991. It had the fastest recovery, which was about 8 years. Dallas also peaked in 1986, bottomed in 1989, and regained its old peak in 1997. That was a period of 11 years. So in spite of what you might want to believe, it is possible for home values to decline. And it is possible for it to take a long time for those prices to recover. Now, the oil bust and the savings and loan crisis of the late 80s are not the same thing we're experiencing today. But the Fed policies to fight inflation are identical to the strategy used in the early 80s. The good news is that every historical example we've looked at, Los Angeles in the early 80s and any Texas market in the late 80s, in every single case, home prices eventually recovered and eventually surpassed their previous highs. Now, we can reasonably expect the same thing is going to happen in the current Austin market, but 2 questions for you. 1, how long is it going to take? And 2, what are you going to do between now and then? These historical periods are evidence that this current downturn will provide opportunities to buy properties for less than what they had been worth and less for what they will eventually appreciate to. If you can figure out the financing, the next several months are going to be one of the best times to buy residential real estate in the Austin Metro. I'm actively working with a couple of lenders to provide alternative financing ideas, and you can expect to see some of that in future videos. For now, if you want to reach out and explore some options, I'm here to help. You know, I get emails, texts, and phone calls almost every day. When people are thinking about buying or selling real estate here in the Austin area, and I'd love to help you out too. If you like this video, you should check out this other one that I did. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. All of my contact information is in the video description. So don't be shy. Let's make your real estate dreams come true.